My name is Harold Lynn, and at the age of 81 I find myself moving more slowly than I used to. Yet I still cling to the routines that have carried me through the years, even as the world around me feels as though it has grown strange and unwelcoming. Every morning begins in the same way. I rise at 6, make my way carefully down the creaking staircase, and sit at the small wooden table in the kitchen where Margaret and I shared breakfasts for almost 6 decades. I place the kettle on the stove, measure out the same coffee we always used, and listen to the familiar hum as the water begins to heat, letting the sound fill the silence that otherwise dominates the house. The ritual has become both comfort and torment. I imagine her sitting across from me in her pale blue robe, humming softly while buttering toast. But the chair remains empty. The only music is the ticking of the old wall clock that she insisted on keeping when we remodeled the kitchen years ago. The house is full of such reminders, and though sometimes I tell myself I should sell it and move into something smaller, the truth is that every room carries a memory I cannot bear to part with, even the painful ones, for without them the walls would be nothing more than plaster and wood. Margaret's absence weighs heavily, not only because she was my wife, but because she had been the center of my world, the steady anchor that made life bearable even during the roughest storms. For the last 4 years before she passed, I devoted myself entirely to her care, watching the woman who had once been so full of energy and wit decline under the weight of illness that seemed determined to steal her piece by piece. It was exhausting, yes, but it never occurred to me that there was an alternative. When she could no longer stand, I lifted her. When she struggled to eat, I fed her spoon by spoon. And when the nights grew long and sleepless, I sat by her side and whispered old stories, hoping the familiarity of my voice might bring her peace. People often praised me for my devotion, but in truth, I never saw it as devotion. It was simply what a husband does when he has made a promise at the altar and intends to keep it until the very last breath. Her final days were quiet, spent mostly in silence, and though the doctor insisted she did not suffer, I know she felt the weight of leaving behind the life we had built together, the home she cherished, and perhaps even me, the man she worried would not manage well on his own once she was gone. Since her passing, solitude has wrapped itself around me like a heavy blanket that is both suffocating and strangely protective. The neighbors check in from time to time, offering polite condolences or dropping off a casserole, but as weeks turned to months, their visits grew less frequent, and soon I was left with only my thoughts for company. I learned quickly that loneliness is not simply the absence of people. It is the sharp awareness that those who once mattered most no longer sit within reach. My daughter, Kendra, phones occasionally, though always in a hurried tone, as though she is squeezing in her calls between appointments, her voice polished and distant, like the professional lawyer she married, rather than the girl who once ran, barefoot across the yard, clutching daisies in her hands. She and her husband have built a life far away from mine, filled with business dinners, social functions, and travel, none of which include me except as an afterthought when they need someone to remind them of their roots. I try not to hold it against her, yet I cannot help but notice that the moments she speaks to me with true warmth are rare, and usually when money or inheritance hovers unspoken between us. Despite her detachment, I remember Kendra as a bright-eyed child, forever asking questions about how the world worked, curling up on the couch beside Margaret during storms, demanding stories until she drifted off to sleep. Those memories cling to me stubbornly, and sometimes I find myself searching her face even now for traces of the little girl she used to be. But it becomes harder each year, as if adulthood has painted over her innocence with layers of calculation and ambition, leaving behind someone I recognize only in fragments. Margaret used to defend her, saying our daughter was simply practical, but I often suspected there was something colder beneath that practicality, something Margaret chose not to see, or perhaps hoped time would soften. For years I dismissed such thoughts, convincing myself that distance between parents and children was natural, that careers and families of their own demanded attention, and that perhaps I was expecting too much. Yet now, with Margaret gone and the silence of the house pressing in, I find myself craving even a fraction of the closeness I once believed was unbreakable. The estate we live on, or perhaps I should say the estate I still live on, was the pride of our lives, not because it was grand, but because it was ours. I bought the land in my 20s, working nights and weekends until we could afford to build the modest but sturdy home that still stands today. Every nail, every board carried sweat from my hands, and Margaret was right there beside me, painting walls and planting the first garden in soil that had never before known anything but weeds. Through the decades, the house expanded, rooms added for Kendra's childhood, a garage for the cars, even a porch where we would sit during summer evenings, sipping lemonade while fireflies lit up the fields. To outsiders, it may appear like any other rural property, unremarkable and easily overlooked, but for us it was the backdrop to our entire marriage, the silent witness to birthdays, holidays, quarrels, reconciliations, and countless quiet moments that gave our lives meaning. I cannot imagine abandoning it, though I know Kendra views it differently, as little more than an asset to be calculated, divided, or sold. In the stillness of my evenings, I often find myself rehearsing conversations with Margaret as though she were still here, telling her about my day, about the ache in my knees, or the letter I received from an old friend. I even tell her about Kendra, though I soften the edges, unwilling to let bitterness creep into the memory of the daughter we raised together. At times I wonder whether Margaret foresaw the struggles that would come after her passing, whether she anticipated the tensions that would surface once inheritance loomed in the distance. She was always perceptive, often more than I gave her credit for, and in her final months I recall moments when she looked at me with an intensity that suggested she was carrying unspoken thoughts. Perhaps she knew the storm that would come. Perhaps she left instructions that I do not yet fully understand. What I do know is that she insisted on visiting our lawyer not long before her decline worsened, and while she assured me it was merely to put affairs in order, the secrecy of the meeting has lingered in my mind. I let it pass at the time, too weary to press for details, but now, sitting alone in this house that feels both like sanctuary and prison, I realize that whatever she arranged may very well shape the remainder of my days. As I prepare myself for the weeks ahead, I feel the slow tightening of threads that connect me to my daughter, threads frayed by years of distance and neglect, yet still intact enough to pull painfully at my heart. I do not know whether I will find reconciliation or betrayal, whether the home Margaret and I built with our hands will remain my refuge or become a battleground for greed. But I do know one thing. I must hold firm to the dignity that has carried me through a lifetime. I am an old man, yes, but I am not yet ready to be dismissed, not yet willing to surrender the last remnants of what Margaret and I created together. This house is more than property. This life is more than numbers on paper. And though the world may treat me as though I am already fading, I remain here, present, remembering, and waiting to see how the story will unfold. The day of Margaret's funeral unfolded in a haze, as though time itself had grown heavy and sluggish, dragging me through each ritual without allowing me to pause long enough to understand the full gravity of what was happening. The church was filled with neighbors, old friends, and distant relatives who had not set foot in our home for years, but now came dressed in solemn black, offering handshakes and murmured condolences that sounded rehearsed, as if spoken out of duty rather than genuine grief. I sat in the front pew with hands folded tightly in my lap, staring at the polished coffin that contained the woman who had been my entire life, and though tears threatened constantly, I held them back with the stubborn pride of a man who felt it his duty to appear composed even when the inside of his chest felt like it was caving in. My daughter Kendra arrived late, gliding down the aisle with the grace of someone accustomed to being observed, her black dress elegant, her hair perfectly arranged, her face touched with just enough sorrow to convince onlookers of her mourning, though when she leaned down to kiss my cheek, her eyes betrayed a detached impatience, as if she were already planning the rest of her day beyond the ceremony. The service passed in fragments I can hardly remember, hymns sung half-heartedly, the pastor speaking about Margaret's kindness and devotion in phrases that felt too small for the enormity of who she was. At the cemetery, where the autumn wind rattled through the bare branches, Kendra stood beside me but offered no hand to hold, instead clutching her designer handbag as though it might blow away. When the last clumps of earth were thrown onto the coffin, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind only the immediate family. Kendra turned to me, her lips pressed into a line that might have been mistaken for grief, but was in fact the expression she wore when she was about to discuss something unpleasant. She suggested we head back to the house, not to share memories of her mother or to comfort each other, but because, as she said in her crisp, efficient tone, there were practical matters we needed to address sooner rather than later. I nodded silently, too weary to argue, and allowed her husband to drive us in his sleek black car back to the house that had been Margaret's pride. Inside the Filiou, the familiar rooms were heavy with silence. I had expected Kendra might at least sit with me for a while, perhaps share tea and recall moments of her childhood with her mother, but instead she strode through the rooms with quick, assessing eyes, as though she were a prospective buyer at an open house. She paused at the fireplace, remarked on how it might be expensive to modernize, and then walked toward the kitchen, running her fingers across the counters with a critical look. Her husband trailed behind her, silent but clearly approving of her inspection, while I followed in stunned disbelief, unable to reconcile the memory of the little girl who once played hide-and-seek in these very rooms with the calculating woman now, treating them as potential real estate. Finally, as the shadows lengthened in the late afternoon light, she returned to the living room, where I had sunk into my chair, exhausted and numb. She stood before me, her posture rigid, and in a voice low enough that her husband would not overhear, she whispered words that struck me harder than any blow I could have imagined. "After Mom's funeral, the estate is ours. You understand that, don't you?" For a long moment I could not speak. Her words rang in my ears, sharp and cold, cutting through the fog of grief with merciless clarity. I stared at her, waiting for some flicker of irony, some sign that she was speaking in confusion brought on by sorrow, but her expression remained flat and unyielding. She was not grieving her mother. She was staking a claim. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sand, and managed to whisper back, "Your mother has been in the ground not an hour, and you are already talking about property." Kendra did not flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing, and said, "That's the way life is, Dad. We have to be realistic. You can't live here forever. And you know it. This house is too much for you, too much to maintain. You'd be better off in a place where you're taken care of. Let me and Matthew handle the estate." It's what Mom would have wanted. Her use of those words, "what Mom would have wanted," sent a shiver of anger through me, because I knew better than anyone what Margaret truly wanted. She had told me in quiet moments that her greatest hope was that I would remain in the home we built together until my last days, surrounded by the familiar comfort of our shared life. The suggestion that she would ever have wished to push me into some sterile facility was an insult to her memory, and I felt my hands tremble with a mixture of rage and sorrow. Yet I said nothing, because I realized that Kendra was no longer speaking as a daughter, but as an heir, and heirs do not speak with the language of love, but with the language of possession. The evening descended into an uneasy silence. Kendra and Matthew made themselves comfortable in the dining room, discussing in hushed voices matters they clearly did not want me to overhear, though occasionally I caught fragments about appraisals, taxes, and future sales. I retreated to my bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed we had shared for so many years, and pressed my hands against my face, trying to block out the sound of their voices carrying through the walls. It was in that moment that the reality of my new life sank in. Not only had I lost my wife, the person who gave my days meaning, but I was also on the verge of losing the home that embodied everything we had built. I remembered then that Margaret had gone to see our lawyer, Mr. Raines, not long before her health collapsed, and though at the time I had been too preoccupied with her care to ask questions, I now realized she must have anticipated this very moment. She must have known Kendra's ambitions would surface like vultures circling a fresh grave, and she must have taken steps to protect me. As I lay awake that night, the house darker than it had ever seemed before, I replayed Kendra's whispered words again and again, each repetition carving deeper into my chest until I felt hollow. After Mom's funeral, the estate is ours. Ours, she said, as if I'd already vanished, as if my years of labor, my decades of love, my sacrifices and care meant nothing more than a temporary placeholder until she could take ownership. I understood then that my grief was no longer solely for Margaret, but also for the daughter I had raised, the daughter who had once clung to my hand with trust, but who now regarded me as an obstacle to be removed. And though I did not yet know the form it would take, I sensed with absolute certainty that a reckoning was coming, one that would reveal truths neither of us were prepared to face. The days following the funeral blurred together in a haze of grief and unease, yet beneath the sorrow that clung to me like damp fog, there pulsed an undercurrent of something colder, sharper, something that grew more defined with each passing hour. Kendra had not repeated her whispered words about the estate, but she did not need to. Her actions spoke with a clarity more cutting than any argument. On the third morning, I awoke to the sound of voices in the hallway, firm, business-like voices that did not belong in a house still heavy with mourning. When I came downstairs, still wearing the cardigan Margaret had knitted for me years ago, I found my daughter standing beside a stranger in a tailored suit, a man holding a clipboard and casting his eyes around the room with the dispassionate scrutiny of someone who saw not memories and history but numbers and square footage. He nodded politely at me, introduced himself as an appraiser, and explained that he had been asked to prepare an estimate of the property's market value. My gaze shifted to Kendra, who stood stiffly by the fireplace, arms folded, her lips pressed into that thin line I knew too well. She did not even attempt to soften the blow. "Dad, it's just a routine assessment," she said. "We need to know what everything is worth. It's for your own good." Her words rang false, and the hollowness in them stung worse than any insult, for they were delivered with that professional detachment she had perfected in her legal career, as if I were not her father, but merely another client, or worse, an obstacle to a transaction. I wanted to shout, to tell the man to leave, to demand that my daughter explain herself, yet I found myself frozen, my tongue heavy in my mouth, because deep inside I knew this moment was only the beginning. The appraiser moved from room to room, scribbling notes, taking photographs, occasionally murmuring comments about outdated fixtures or possible renovations. Kendra followed close behind him, nodding thoughtfully, asking questions, pointing out details I had never noticed, as if the house she had once grown up in was now nothing more than a commodity to be packaged and sold. I trailed behind them at a distance, my heart pounding with every shutter click of his camera, each one feeling like the sound of nails being hammered into the coffin of my life as I had known it. When they reached the bedroom, I could no longer bear it. I stepped forward and placed myself between the man and the bed where Margaret had spent her final nights, where I had sat holding her hand and whispering to her when words had failed. "This room is not for sale," I said, my voice low but steady, my hands trembling only slightly. The man glanced at me uncertainly, then looked to Kendra, who merely sighed, her patience thinning. "Dad," she said, as though speaking to a stubborn child, "please, this is necessary. We have to think about the future. You can't stay here forever. It's too much house for one person, and you're not getting any younger. This is about practicality." I met her eyes then, searching desperately for a flicker of the daughter I had once known, but all I saw was steel. With a curt wave of her hand, she instructed the appraiser to continue, and in that moment I felt a gulf open between us so wide I wondered if it had been growing unseen for years, waiting only for Margaret's death to finally reveal its true breadth. That evening, after the appraiser had gone and the echo of his footsteps no longer haunted the halls, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, my mind turning back to the last clear conversation I had shared with Margaret. She had spoken of the lawyer, of wanting to leave something behind that would protect me, and though she had not told me exactly what she had done, I realized with a sharp certainty that she had foreseen this very moment. My grief-stricken daughter, driven not by love but by ambition, was already treating me as a relic to be catalogued and swept aside. I resolved then that I would not let Margaret's foresight go to waste. The next morning, with a determination that surprised even me, I put on my coat and walked slowly, painfully, to the office of Mr. Raines, the family lawyer who had served us for decades. The office smelled faintly of leather and old books, a place of order and permanence. Mr. Raines, a man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, rose from his desk to greet me with a handshake that lingered with genuine concern. He listened quietly as I described the events of the past days, the funeral, Kendra's whispered words, the arrival of the appraiser, and his brow furrowed with each detail. When I finally fell silent, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Your wife was a wise woman," he said softly. "She came to see me a few months before her passing. She asked me to prepare something unusual, but very clear. She made a video testament. She wanted her voice to be heard directly, without interpretation, without the possibility of manipulation. The words struck me with both relief and dread. Relief, because it meant Margaret had thought ahead, had cared enough to shield me from what she must have known was coming. Dread, because it confirmed my darkest suspicion. She had not trusted our daughter to act with compassion. I asked to see the recording immediately, but Mr. Raines shook his head. "Your wife left specific instructions," he explained. "The testament is not to be played until the entire family is present. She wanted no secret viewings, no whispers behind closed doors. She wanted the truth revealed openly, with everyone who has a stake in her estate sitting together. That was her condition, and as her lawyer, I am bound to honor it." For a moment I felt frustration rising, a desperate urge to hear her voice, to cling to one last fragment of her presence. Yet even in my desperation I understood why she had insisted on such a condition. Margaret had always believed in fairness, in facing the truth directly rather than allowing it to be twisted in shadows. I left the office with heavy steps, clutching the knowledge of that unseen video like a lifeline, the only shield I had against the storm I knew was gathering. When I returned home, Kendra was already waiting. She sat at the dining table with papers spread before her, documents filled with numbers and terms I did not understand, though I recognized enough to know they concerned the estate. She looked up briefly, offered a thin smile, and asked where I had been. "Out," I replied, simply, unwilling to share the details of my visit. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, but she said nothing more, turning back to her paperwork with the cold focus of someone preparing for battle. I stood there for a long time, watching her, feeling the weight of Margaret's absence more acutely than ever. For years, I had believed that blood was enough to bind us, that no matter how far she drifted, Kendra would always be my daughter. But as I looked at her now, surrounded by contracts and figures, I realized with aching clarity that love alone was no longer enough. The first blows had been struck, and the war for the soul of our family and for the home Margaret and I had built had already begun. The weeks that followed were heavy with a kind of suffocating tension, the kind that builds silently in the corners of a house until it seems to seep into the walls themselves, making every step echo louder and every glance carry double meaning. Kendra began appearing at the property more frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes with her husband, and always with folders tucked beneath her arm or her phone, buzzing with conversations I was never meant to overhear. Their visits were no longer framed as moments of family concern. They were inspections, strategic maneuvers in a game that I was only beginning to understand. One evening I caught sight of her through the window, standing in the driveway and pointing out features of the house to a man I did not recognize, a man who leaned against his car with the posture of a broker evaluating a potential deal. The sight turned my stomach. I opened the door and called her name, and she turned sharply, offering me a smile that was too quick, too rehearsed, assuring me that he was just a friend giving advice. Her words fell flat because I could see the truth in the way she avoided my eyes, in the way her husband shifted uncomfortably beside her. It was that moment, standing in the threshold with the evening wind curling around us, that I understood I could no longer remain a passive observer. Margaret's video testament had become not just a mystery, but a weapon, one that I sensed might be the only thing standing between me and dispossession. I returned to Mr. Raines and insisted that the time had come to honor my wife's instructions. He listened carefully, and after a long pause he agreed, though his eyes betrayed the weight of what was to come. "If we do this," he said, "you must be prepared for the consequences. Your daughter will not take it lightly. She has already acted as though control belongs to her, and this will not only deny her claim, but expose truths she may not be ready to face." I told him that I was prepared, though inside I felt anything but. I was an old man, worn down by grief and years of compromise, yet there was a flicker of resolve that I had not felt since my youth, the determination of a builder who once stood on bare land and envisioned a home where none existed. Arrangements were made for a gathering in Raines's office, a meeting to which all parties were summoned, myself, Kendra, her husband, and to my surprise, Margaret's brother Floyd, who had long lived on the fringes of our family. He was a bitter man, hardened by years of failed ventures and resentment, and though I had little affection for him, I knew that his presence meant one more pair of hands reaching for what Margaret had left behind. The day of the meeting arrived gray and overcast, the sky pressing low as if mirroring the heaviness in my chest. I walked slowly into the office, my cane tapping against the worn carpet, and found them all waiting. Kendra, with her arms crossed and her expression a mask of icy control, her husband, with his ever-watchful eyes, and Floyd slouched in his chair, smirking faintly as though he had already claimed victory. The air in the room was taut with unspoken accusations, and before Mr. Raines could even begin, Kendra leaned forward and spoke in a tone that balanced between condescension and authority. "Dad, this doesn't have to be complicated. You've had your time here, and no one is trying to take anything away from you unfairly. But you must admit it's unrealistic to keep this house. It's too big, too old, and you cannot manage it alone. We're offering you stability. We'll handle everything, and you'll be comfortable." Her words were rehearsed, polished like an argument before a jury, and for a moment I almost admired her skill, until I remembered that I was not her opponent in a courtroom, but her father, the man who had carried her in his arms when she was sick, who had worked late nights to pay for her education, who had built the very roof she now dismissed as inconvenient. I remained silent, letting her words hang in the air like smoke, and only when Raines cleared his throat did the tension shift. He moved to the small television in the corner, inserted a disc, and with deliberate care pressed play. The screen flickered, and there she was, Margaret, my Margaret, sitting in the very chair where I had so often seen her in life, her hair thinner, her face lined with illness, but her eyes steady and filled with the same clarity I had fallen in love with decades earlier. For a moment I could not breathe. Her voice, though softer than I remembered, filled the room with a calm authority that silenced even Floyd's restless tapping fingers. "If you are watching this," she began, "it means I am no longer with you, and that knowledge alone brings me sorrow. But I cannot leave without speaking directly, without ensuring that my wishes are heard in my own voice. Harold, my beloved husband, you devoted yourself to me without complaint, and it is my deepest wish that you remain in our home for as long as you draw breath. This house is more than walls and windows. It is the memory of our life together, and it belongs to you. I ask that no one, not even our daughter, attempt to take that from you." Her eyes shifted then, and though she could not see the room, it felt as though she looked directly at Kendra. "My dear girl, I know you are strong, ambitious, and determined, and those qualities can serve you well in life. But I also know that you have sometimes mistaken ambition for necessity, and in doing so, you have forgotten the value of love over possession. I cannot allow this home to be reduced to an asset on a balance sheet. It is Harold's, for as long as he wishes, and that is final." A silence followed that was heavier than any argument. Kendra's face drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief, while her husband's jaw tightened in barely concealed frustration. Floyd let out a low whistle, muttering something under his breath about wasted opportunities. But before anyone could speak, the screen flickered again, and Margaret's voice returned, softer now, but edged with something that made my heart pound. "There is one more truth that must be spoken," she said. "Kendra, you have grown your whole life believing that Harold is your father in every sense. In every way that matters, he is. He raised you, loved you, and sacrificed for you. But the truth is that you are not his by blood. You are mine, but your biological father was another. Harold knew, and he chose to raise you as his own, never once withholding his love. That is the greatest inheritance you could ever receive, the love of a man who owed you nothing, but gave you everything." The room erupted into chaos, voices colliding like crashing waves, but I remained still, my eyes fixed on the fading screen, where Margaret's image lingered for one final second before disappearing into darkness. My heart ached with the weight of old secrets revealed, yet beneath the ache there was clarity. The battle had shifted, and nothing in our family would ever be the same again. The days that followed the revelation of Margaret's testament were like living inside a storm that refused to pass, a storm where lightning kept flashing, but thunder never rolled away, leaving the air so thick with tension that even silence felt dangerous. I had walked out of Raines's office after the video ended with my heart pounding and my head filled with Margaret's words, both her tender defense of me and her devastating confession that the girl I had raised as my own was not mine by blood. I had thought in that moment that the shock of such a truth would shatter Kendra into silence, but I underestimated the force of her pride, her unwillingness to accept defeat, and her determination to twist even the clearest truth into a narrative that served her ambitions. She had left the lawyer's office in a fury, her heels striking the floor like hammers, her husband rushing to keep pace with her as she flung accusations behind her, accusations not at her mother, who had spoken the truth from beyond the grave, but at me, the man who had kept her secret, protected her from shame, and chosen love over bitterness decades ago. The first confrontation came the very next morning when I awoke to the sound of pounding on my front door. When I opened it, Kendra stood there, her eyes red from lack of sleep, her hair disheveled, her voice already raised as if she had been rehearsing accusations all night. She stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation, her husband trailing behind her with that permanent expression of smug calculation that seemed to grow sharper with every conflict. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking. "How dare you sit there while that woman destroyed me with her lies? You should have stopped her. You should have told me years ago. You let me live my whole life believing a lie, and now you stand there acting like some kind of martyr? Because she gave you the house." Her words struck hard, but beneath the anger I heard something else. Fear. The fear of a woman who had built her entire sense of identity on certain truths and now found them pulled out from under her like rotten boards in a collapsing floor. I tried to answer her calmly, to tell her that Margaret's decision was not an act of cruelty, but of love, that she wanted the truth to be known not to shame Kendra, but to free her from illusions, and that I had chosen to raise her because she was mine in every way that mattered. But she would not listen. She paced the room like a caged animal, throwing her arms up in disbelief, insisting that the will was fraudulent, that the video could have been manipulated, that Margaret had been too sick to make rational decisions, that I had coerced her somehow into stripping our daughter of her rightful inheritance. Her husband added fuel to the fire, muttering legal terms and half-threats, hinting at contests to the will, at guardianship hearings, at challenges to my capacity to manage the estate. It was clear that their plan was to make me look feeble and incompetent, to paint me as an old man manipulated by grief, a man unfit to handle property or finances. The cruelty of their accusations cut deeper because they knew precisely where to aim. They mocked the way I struggled sometimes to find my glasses, the way my hands shook slightly when I tried to sign my name, the way I forgot details of appointments until I wrote them down. All the ordinary frailties of age, the things I had accepted with quiet dignity, were now sharpened into weapons to be used against me. And though I knew in my heart that Margaret had safeguarded me with her testament, I also knew that legal battles could drag on for years, draining not just money but energy. And I feared that was their true aim, to exhaust me until I surrendered, simply to find peace. In the days that followed, the escalation was relentless. Letters began to arrive, drafted by their attorneys, each one filled with accusations, insinuations, and threats couched in formal language that left no doubt of their intent. Neighbors reported seeing Kendra outside the property speaking with strangers, sometimes men in suits, sometimes contractors who walked the perimeter of the house as though already envisioning changes they might make once the place was in her control. I even caught her once unlocking the side gate with a spare key she must have kept for decades, striding into the garden without announcing herself, examining the flower beds her mother had loved so dearly, and muttering that the land could be repurposed. When I confronted her, she met my anger with icy disdain, saying, "This isn't about you, Dad. This is about preserving what Mom built, and you're too blind to see it. You're clinging to the past when the future requires responsibility." Her words dripped with the arrogance of someone who mistook greed for duty, yet there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed how much the revelation about her paternity gnawed at her beneath the armor of her bravado. One evening, I received a call from Mr. Raines. His tone was grave as he informed me that Kendra and her husband had filed preliminary motions to contest the will, citing questions about Margaret's mental capacity at the time of the recording. He assured me that the evidence was on our side, that medical records confirmed her clarity and soundness in those final months. But he also warned me that such challenges were rarely about truth. They were about pressure, about grinding down the opposition until compromise seemed preferable to endurance. As I listened to his steady voice, I realized that I had become the center of a battle I had never sought, a battle in which my own daughter had chosen to cast me as the enemy. Yet even as they pressed their attack, something inside me hardened. For too long I had allowed guilt, love, and longing for connection to soften my defenses, to make excuses for their behavior, to hope that kindness might someday be reciprocated. But Margaret's testament had stripped away the illusions. She had seen what I had refused to see, that our daughter was not guided by filial love but by calculation, and that unless I stood firm, the legacy we had built together would be swallowed by her ambition. Each insult, each letter from their lawyers, each cold intrusion into the home I had built only steeled my resolve further. The escalation reached its most grotesque form during a gathering they insisted upon, a meeting at a restaurant in town where they demanded I appear for a civil discussion. Foolishly, I agreed, hoping that perhaps in public their tone might soften. Instead, I found myself cornered at a table while Kendra delivered a rehearsed speech about my declining state, citing imagined lapses and invented incidents, such as supposedly leaving the stove on or misplacing sums of money, none of which had ever occurred. Her husband sat beside her, nodding solemnly, occasionally adding comments about the dangers of allowing an aging man to bear such responsibility. They spoke as though I were not even present, as though I were already diminished to a shadow of myself, a burden to be shifted around like furniture. I sat there gripping my cup, listening to the lies with a stillness I did not know I possessed, until finally I leaned forward and said quietly, "You can invent all the stories you like, but the truth is written in your mother's voice, and no lawyer or lie can erase it." The words silenced them for only a moment, but in that silence I saw something flicker across Kendra's face, a mixture of rage and desperation. It was not just about the house, not just about money. It was about the revelation of her blood, the secret that had stripped her of the identity she had clung to. She was not fighting merely to claim property. She was fighting to bury the truth, to reassert control over a life suddenly cracked down the middle. In that realization, I understood that this battle would not be won by arguments alone, because it was rooted not in reason, but in the deepest insecurities of a woman who could not face who she truly was. I left that restaurant with my shoulders straighter than they had been in months, because for the first time I felt no shame in resisting. The second escalation had revealed their strategy in full: to undermine me, to isolate me, to strip me of dignity so that I might surrender. But Margaret had foreseen this, and her voice still lingered in my ears, calm, steady, insistent that I remain in the home we built. I resolved then that I would fight, not with their weapons of deceit and intimidation, but with the truth, with patience, and with the quiet strength of a man who had spent his entire life building rather than tearing down. They had underestimated me, and soon they would learn that even an old man, weary with grief, can still summon the resolve to protect what truly matters. The weeks of tension and threats, the endless stream of letters and accusations, had brought me to the edge of exhaustion, yet I knew that the moment of final confrontation was coming. The moment Margaret had prepared for when she sat before that camera and spoke her last words. It came not in the form of another letter or whispered threat, but in a summons from the court, a hearing to determine whether the testament would stand uncontested or whether Kendra's challenge would gain traction. For nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house, imagining Margaret's presence beside me, her voice steady in my mind, telling me not to falter. I dreaded the humiliation of having my life dissected in public, of being portrayed as frail and incompetent, but I also knew there was no turning back. The house was not just a house. It was our life, our years, our memories, and if I surrendered now, I would not only lose the roof above me, but also betray everything my wife had entrusted to me in her final days. The day of the hearing dawned cold and sharp, the kind of morning where the air bites at your lungs and every sound seems amplified. I dressed carefully, choosing the suit Margaret had once insisted made me look dignified, polished my shoes until they shone, and straightened my tie with hands that trembled only slightly. When I entered the courthouse, I saw them waiting. Kendra, with her lawyer's mask of composure firmly in place, her husband at her side whispering strategy, and Floyd slouched against the wall with that familiar smirk, as though relishing the spectacle more than any outcome. They glanced at me with a mixture of disdain and pity, as though certain they were about to watch an old man crumble. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, called the case forward, and Kendra's attorney began his argument with polished precision. He spoke of Margaret's illness, suggesting that her mind had been clouded, that she had been manipulated, that I, desperate and fearful, had pressured her into altering her wishes. He painted a picture of me as a man slipping into senility, unable to manage finances, vulnerable to confusion. Each word was a dagger carefully crafted to wound, and I felt the weight of the room shift against me, the murmurs of strangers whispering doubt. Kendra sat tall and still, her expression impassive, but her eyes glimmered with the faint satisfaction of someone who believed victory was inevitable. Then it was our turn. Mr. Raines stood, his presence calm and steady, and he laid out the evidence with deliberate clarity. He spoke of Margaret's medical evaluations, of doctors who had certified her mind as sharp and sound in those final months, of the measures she had taken to ensure her testament was beyond dispute. And then, with the slow gravity of a man revealing the final card in a long game, he announced that the court would now hear directly from Margaret herself. The room stilled as the screen flickered to life once again, and there she was, my wife, speaking not to us but through time, her voice filling the chamber with undeniable truth. She repeated what I had already heard, her wishes clear and firm, her reasoning thoughtful, her love for me woven into every word. But hearing it in that setting, before the judge and strangers and even those who sought to tear it apart, gave it a power I had not expected. The judge leaned forward, listening intently, her expression unreadable, but I could see in her eyes the recognition of sincerity. When Margaret spoke of Kendra, her voice softened, but the weight of her disappointment was unmistakable. She did not scold, she did not condemn, but she laid bare the truth with a gentleness that carried more authority than anger ever could. And then came the revelation of paternity, the truth that had already detonated our family in private, now unveiled under the unflinching eye of the law. Gasps echoed through the courtroom, and for the first time I saw Kendra's composure falter, her face flushing crimson as though the walls themselves had betrayed her. When the video ended, the silence that followed was unbearable, a silence so thick it seemed to press against my chest. Kendra's attorney stammered, attempted to recover, tried to suggest again that Margaret had been confused, but the words sounded hollow after hearing Margaret's calm, unwavering testimony. The judge raised a hand to silence him, her expression stern, and turned her gaze toward my daughter. "Do you wish to respond?" she asked. For the first time in years, Kendra seemed at a loss for words. Her lips parted, closed, opened again, but no sound came. Finally, with her eyes blazing, she turned toward me, and in a voice low but seething with rage, she hissed, "You should have told me. You should have given me the truth yourself." Her accusation struck hard, not because it was fair, but because it revealed the core of her fury. It was not only the loss of the estate that burned her, it was the collapse of the identity she had carried her entire life. She was not fighting simply for property, but for a sense of self she no longer recognized, and in that moment I felt a stab of pity, even through my anger. But pity did not mean surrender. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, but my voice steady, and I looked not at her, but at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, "my wife spoke for herself, and I will not tarnish her words by adding more. She built this home with me, she lived in it with me, and she died knowing it would remain with me. That is all there is to say." The judge nodded, her expression softening for just a moment, and then she delivered her ruling. The testament would stand, the property, the home would remain mine, protected by the very voice of the woman who had lived within its walls. The challenge was dismissed. The words struck the air like a gavel, final and unshakable, and in that instant I felt something inside me break loose. Not despair, but relief. A release of a burden I had carried since the day of Margaret's death. Kendra rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, her face twisted with rage and humiliation. She stormed out of the courtroom without a backward glance, her husband following in tight-lipped silence, while Floyd muttered curses under his breath and shuffled away. I remained seated, staring at the blank screen where Margaret's face had last appeared, wishing desperately that she could see what she had accomplished, that she could know her wisdom had prevailed. For the first time in many months I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to feel the weight of victory not as triumph, but as survival. When I finally stood and left the courtroom, the cold air outside felt like a baptism, sharp and cleansing. The storm had reached its peak and broken, and though the sky above was still heavy with clouds, I knew the worst had passed. I walked slowly back to the car, each step steady, each breath filled with a quiet certainty that I had honored Margaret's will, that I had stood firm not only for myself, but for the life we had built together. And though the scars of what had transpired would remain, though Kendra's betrayal would haunt me until my final days, I knew that dignity had been preserved, and with it, a measure of peace. The days after the hearing passed with a strange quiet that felt almost unreal, as though the world itself was pausing to let me catch my breath after months of being battered by conflict and betrayal. The house, once echoing with tension whenever Kendra and her husband came striding through its rooms as though they already owned them, was mine again in every sense, not only legally, but spiritually, for Margaret's voice still lingered in every corner, her calm determination having silenced their schemes more effectively than I ever could have managed alone. I spent those first days walking through the rooms at my own pace, touching the furniture we had chosen together, running my fingers along the windowsills she had once polished every spring, sitting for hours on the porch with the old rocking chair, creaking beneath me, letting the air and silence sink into my bones. I was not triumphant, for there was no joy in defeating one's own child, but there was relief, and with it came a fragile kind of peace that I had thought lost forever. Kendra did not return after the courtroom confrontation, not to the house, and not even to the town. Neighbors told me they had seen her car speeding away that same afternoon, her face pale with rage, her husband silent beside her. I did not try to call her. For the first time in my life, I felt no duty to chase after her, no obligation to mend what she had torn. The revelation of her true paternity was something I could not soften, could not make easier by words, and I knew that any attempt to reach out would be met with accusations and bitterness. Instead, I chose silence, not out of anger, but out of recognition that some wounds must be faced alone. Perhaps one day she would return, and perhaps one day she would understand that the truth her mother left was not meant to wound her, but to free her. But that day was not now, and until it came, I would carry on with the life that remained to me. Floyd, true to his nature, muttered threats about appealing, about dragging the matter further, but within weeks his bluster fizzled into nothing, for he lacked both the resources and the determination to sustain such a battle. His greed had always outweighed his endurance, and once he realized there was no profit to be had, he faded back into the shadows where he had always lived, a bitter man chasing opportunities that never came. In his absence, the house grew quieter still, the circle of conflict narrowing until it was only me and Margaret's memory within these walls. It was in that quiet that I rediscovered something I had thought gone with her passing, the ability to sit in stillness and not feel entirely alone. I took to rising early, as I always had, brewing coffee and sitting at the kitchen table while the morning light spread across the fields outside, and sometimes, when the light caught the glass just right, I could almost imagine her reflection, sitting across from me, smiling in that way she used to when I was too serious, reminding me that even the heaviest burdens could be borne with grace. I spoke to her often, not aloud, but in my thoughts, telling her about the hearings, about the way her video had stunned the courtroom into silence, about the strength her words had given me when mine faltered. And though I received no answer, I felt her presence more strongly than I ever had in those last sick years, as though by leaving her words behind she had anchored herself to this place, making sure I would never truly be without her. There were moments of sorrow, of course, moments when I would look at old photographs of Kendra as a child, her smile wide and unguarded, her arms around both of us, and I would ache with the memory of how simple it had once been, how full of promise and love. I wondered if she looked at those same photographs now with bitterness, if she had thrown them away or hidden them, unable to reconcile the man who raised her with the truth of her blood. That thought pained me more than her anger ever could, but I did not let it consume me. Margaret had told her the truth, not to break her, but to give her a chance to rebuild herself honestly, and though Kendra might despise me for what I had withheld, I hoped she would one day see that my silence had been born of love, not betrayal. Life settled into a rhythm again, a quieter rhythm, but not an empty one. I tended to the garden Margaret had loved, planting flowers she had chosen year after year, kneeling carefully among the beds and letting the earth work its healing into my hands. I repaired small things around the house, not because they urgently needed fixing, but because the act of maintaining the home felt like honoring her memory, a way of proving to myself that I was still capable, still the man she had trusted to carry on without her. And in the evenings, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink behind the fields, the air cooling, the crickets beginning their chorus, and I allowed myself to feel something I had not felt in many months, gratitude. The estate was secure, my dignity intact, and though my relationship with Kendra lay in ruins, I no longer felt the gnawing fear that had haunted me since Margaret's death, the fear of being cast out, of losing everything that mattered. The storm had come, fierce and merciless, but I had endured it, not by strength alone, but by the foresight and love of the woman who had stood beside me all those years. In the end, it was her voice that saved me, her wisdom that triumphed, and as I sat in the twilight with the photograph of her resting in my lap, I whispered the words I had spoken countless times before, but now carried a weight that only time and loss could give. You were right, my love. You always were, and I will keep your promise as long as I breathe.